The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee, but the air was heavier than it should have been. It was 9:03 a.m., and the board meeting was already in full swing when it happened. "Maria," the chief financial officer said, her voice slicing the silence like a razor, "you don't speak unless spoken to. We've tolerated enough of your crusading." Laughter rippled around the table, polite, clipped, but it was there. 20 pairs of eyes, all in suits, all leaning back in their ergonomic chairs, settled on her, dissecting her like she was some kind of specimen. It was the kind of humiliation that wasn't loud, but deliberate. Like they wanted her to know exactly where she stood, beneath them. Maria adjusted the stack of reports she'd spent the last 3 weeks preparing. They were heavy in her hands, not because of the paper, but because of what they contained. Numbers, patterns, hidden trails in the company's books that nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. Or maybe they already knew and just didn't care. Her jaw tightened. She didn't lower her eyes. "I wasn't aware that truth required permission," she said, her voice even. The CFO's smile froze, like porcelain beginning to crack. "This isn't about truth," he said, leaning forward. "This is about loyalty. If you want to keep your position here, you'll remember that." And just like that, the meeting moved on. Her dignity, apparently, was disposable. The rest of the executives continued discussing quarterly projections, foreign investments, and expansion plans. Maria's mind was elsewhere, on the flagged accounts she had uncovered in the company's sustainability budget. Supposedly, these funds were meant for community projects, environmental restoration, education initiatives. But the numbers told another story. Inflated invoices, shell companies, money rerouted to offshore accounts. She had taken the job at Ferris & Locke International because she believed in the mission they claimed to stand for: ethical investments, social responsibility, sustainability. It was supposed to be a model for how global corporations could be a force for good. But the deeper she worked in the financial department, the more she saw the rot. It wasn't one bad actor. It was a system designed to reward greed and punish dissent. And people like her, people without the right family name or Ivy League stamp on their resume, were meant to be grateful for the scraps. Her phone buzzed under the table. A message from Curon, her one trusted colleague in the department. "Lunch. I have something you need to see." By the time noon came, Maria had rehearsed a dozen ways this could go wrong. She found Kieran in the back corner of a small cafe, the kind where the staff don't hover, and the coffee is always slightly burnt. He looked more tired than usual, his dark eyes scanning the room before he slid an envelope across the table. Inside were printouts of email chains, internal communications between the CFO, the head of legal, and 2 outside contractors. Phrases jumped out at her: redirect surplus, manage external perception, no legal exposure if framed as compliance adjustment. "They're burying it," Kieran said, his voice low. "Every cent they claim is going to the community projects is being siphoned, and they're using a charity partner as the cover." Maria's hands tightened around the papers. This was more than suspicious. It was deliberate fraud. Fraud that impacted real people who would never know they'd been stolen from. "Why bring this to me?" she asked. "Because you're the only one stubborn enough to do something about it," Huron said with a half-smile. "And I'm not in a position to blow this open without losing my visa." The enormity of it pressed in on her. If she went public, she would almost certainly lose her job. Ferris & Locke had an army of lawyers and enough influence to quietly blackball her in the industry. But if she stayed silent, she was complicit. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the documents spread out like pieces of a puzzle she already knew the answer to. Her apartment was small, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the otherwise quiet space. She thought about her parents, about the years they'd worked in factories and warehouses so she could get an education. She thought about the interns who came into the company bright-eyed, believing they were part of something good. And she thought about the faces in that boardroom, the ones who laughed. Over the next week, she played her part. She attended meetings, processed reports, sent emails that were polite but empty. All the while, she was collecting, downloading documents, printing backup copies, tracing financial flows through layers of corporate camouflage. It was dangerous. The company monitored everything. She used encrypted drives, off-site storage, burner devices. The more she found, the clearer it became. The fraud was systemic. Millions diverted over 5 years. The charity they flaunted in every press release was essentially a shell, its projects staged for PR photos and then abandoned. And at the center of it all was the CFO, the same man who had silenced her in front of everyone. One night, as she cross-referenced accounts, she discovered something she hadn't expected. The CEO herself was receiving quarterly discretionary transfers from one of the shell companies. It wasn't just a corrupt CFO. The entire top leadership was in on it. Maria's chest tightened. This wasn't going to be as simple as exposing one bad actor. If she moved against them, she'd be up against the entire machine. Still, the thought of doing nothing was worse. Her chance came 2 weeks later, at the company's annual shareholder meeting. Hundreds of people packed into the auditorium. Investors, employees, media representatives. The event was streamed live, a PR spectacle meant to showcase Ferris and Locke's unwavering commitment to ethical leadership. Maria was seated in the second row, directly behind the press section. She'd memorized her move, a strategically timed question during the open floor session, one that would force the executives to either lie on record or reveal their own deceit. In her bag was a flash drive, every piece of evidence, meticulously organized, encrypted, and copied to multiple secure locations. When the microphone finally reached her, her voice was calm, but carried enough edge to cut through the polished speeches. "My question is for the CFO and the CEO," she began. "Can you explain the discrepancy between the funds allocated for the Green Horizons initiative and the actual disbursements recorded over the past 5 years? Because according to the financial statements I've reviewed, over 60% of that budget has been redirected through third-party contractors with no verifiable project outcomes." The room went still. Cameras pivoted toward her. The CFO's expression didn't change, but his eyes did, narrowing, calculating. "I'm not sure what statements you're referring to," he said smoothly. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "I have the records," she interrupted. "Detailed transfers, internal emails, and invoices. I'd be happy to provide them to the press, since transparency is one of Ferris and Locke's stated values." A ripple moved through the crowd. Investors shifted in their seats. The CEO leaned toward the microphone, smiling the way predators smile when they're cornered. "I think we should speak privately after this, Maria," she said. "I think we should speak publicly," Maria replied. And just like that, the room became a battlefield. The CEO's smile didn't falter, but the silence that followed was the kind that could strip the air from a room. She straightened in her seat, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the podium, as though she could hold the entire narrative in place by sheer will. "Maria," she said, with a voice dipped in full warmth, "we appreciate your passion, but this is neither the time nor the forum for—" "This is exactly the time," Maria said, louder now. The microphone caught the conviction in her tone, and it carried across the hall. "Because this is when you tell your shareholders how their investments are being used or stolen." The audience wasn't entirely on her side. Some faces wore open disapproval, as though her audacity was more offensive than the accusations. Others were leaning forward, eager for spectacle. The press, sensing blood in the water, began scribbling faster. The CFO took the microphone, his voice dripping with controlled disdain. "These are baseless claims from a disgruntled employee with no grasp of the complexities of global finance. I'm sure the board will address this privately. Maria could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. I'm sure you will, she said. But I've already submitted the evidence to an independent auditor and to 2 journalists who will publish regardless of what you say here. The effect was immediate. The stage lights caught the brief, involuntary flicker of panic in the CFO's eyes. The CEO's fingers curled against the podium. They knew she wasn't bluffing. Security began moving toward her. She saw them out of the corner of her eye, their dark suits and expressionless faces cutting through the rows of chairs. Before they could reach her, a voice from the investor section called out, "If she's lying, prove it. Show us the accounts right now." That small eruption of dissent emboldened others. More murmurs, more calls for transparency. The press was recording every second. The CEO's voice stayed steady, but her control was fraying. "We will review these allegations and address them in due course," she said. "This meeting is adjourned." The moment the gavel hit, security closed in. Maria didn't fight them. She'd anticipated this. As they escorted her out, she kept her head high, forcing herself to look directly at the cameras. She wanted the image to stick, the lone figure being dragged from a temple of power for telling the truth. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. Kieran was waiting by the side entrance, phone in hand. "It's already online," he said, showing her the headline from an independent news outlet. "Ferris and Locke Whistleblower accuses executives of massive fraud at live event." Maria exhaled, part relief, part fear. "Now they'll come after me," she said. "They already were," Kieran replied. "Now you've just made it harder for them to do it quietly." Within hours, the company issued a statement denying everything, painting her as an embittered employee twisting data to suit a personal vendetta. They called her allegations reckless, unsubstantiated, and harmful to stakeholders. But the press wasn't letting go. Not yet. The next morning, a journalist from the Sentinel called. "We verified parts of your evidence," she said. "If you have more, now's the time to share it." Maria met her in a cramped newsroom that smelled of ink and burnt coffee. She laid everything out, the emails, the transfer records, the sham charity documentation. The journalist's eyes widened as she flipped through the files. "This isn't just fraud," she murmured. "It's coordinated embezzlement with potential money laundering. And if the CEO's involved—" "She is," Maria said, tapping the section with the quarterly transfers. Publishing meant escalation. Ferris and Locke would unleash their legal team, their PR machinery, and their friends in high places. But once the story was out, it wouldn't belong to the company anymore. That night, Maria's apartment felt smaller than ever. She locked the door twice, checked her phone for spyware, and kept her encrypted drives within reach. The city outside went on as if nothing had changed. Cars passing, laughter spilling from bars, the hum of life continuing. But Maria knew that somewhere in the towers of glass and steel, her name was being discussed in closed-door meetings with words like containment and damage control. 3 days later, the article hit. Front page. Ferris and Locke accused of diverting millions from social initiatives. It named the CFO, the CEO, and detailed the intricate network of shell companies used to reroute funds. The documents were embedded, redacted only for sensitive personal data. The company responded by suing her for defamation and breach of confidentiality. The summons arrived in a crisp white envelope, hand-delivered by someone who didn't even meet her eyes. Kieran came over that night, bringing takeout and a grim smile. "They're trying to bury you in legal fees until you break," he said. "They might," Maria admitted, "but they can't bury the truth now. Too many people have it." Still, the pressure was relentless. Anonymous emails warning her to drop it or regret it. A car idling outside her building for hours. Friends from work who stopped returning her messages. One evening, as she returned from the grocery store, she found her apartment door ajar. Nothing was stolen, but her desk drawers had been rifled through. It was a message. "We can reach you any time." Maria sat on the edge of her bed, steadying her breathing. Fear was a constant now, but it wasn't paralyzing. If anything, it was sharpening her. She doubled her efforts, working with the journalists and the independent auditor. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight, every accusation backed by undeniable proof. She learned quickly that justice wasn't just about being right. It was about being undeniable. Then came the break she hadn't expected. A former Ferris and Locke project manager reached out anonymously, offering testimony. They had witnessed forged reports, staged site visits, and direct orders from the CFO to adjust figures before submission to investors. The testimony was damning, and it corroborated Maria's evidence down to specific dates and amounts. With this, the story couldn't be dismissed as the obsession of one disgruntled employee. It was a pattern, and it was growing harder for the company's allies to defend. The investigation expanded. Government regulatory bodies requested documentation. Investors began quietly pulling their funds. Behind closed doors, the board was fracturing, some members pushing to cut loose the CEO and CFO to save the company's image, others doubling down on defense. Maria stayed mostly in the shadows now, communicating through encrypted channels, meeting sources in crowded public spaces. She knew the system she was up against, its resilience, its talent for self-preservation. But she also knew that cracks were forming. And cracks, if widened enough, could bring down even the tallest structures. The first public fracture came during a televised interview. The CEO was seated under studio lights, her features composed, voice measured. She dismissed the allegations again, but this time her words felt thinner, rehearsed. The interviewer, clearly briefed, pressed harder. Several independent audits now confirmed discrepancies in Ferris and Locke's financial statements, he said. "Are you saying they're all wrong?" She paused, just a fraction of a second too long. Cameras don't forgive hesitation. "I'm saying," she replied carefully, "that context matters, and these so-called discrepancies are simply the result of misinterpretations." But that pause was enough. Clips of it circulated within hours, paired with headlines like "CEO falters under fraud questions." The machine that had always controlled the narrative was losing its grip. Maria watched from her small kitchen, coffee cooling beside her laptop. The sight didn't bring satisfaction, not yet. It was too early for that. She knew the system would rather burn down evidence than surrender quietly. That night, an encrypted message came through from Kiran. "We have a problem. The whistleblower witness is spooked. Says someone approached them at their kids' school." Maria's stomach turned. It was the oldest tactic in the book. Make it personal. Make it dangerous. She called the witness immediately. Their voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "I want to help, but my family—" "I understand," Maria said, keeping her voice steady. "Don't take risks. I'll find another way." Hanging up, she felt the familiar mix of anger and clarity. Ferris and Locke wasn't just fighting for survival. They were waging psychological warfare. The next day, a box arrived at her door. No return address. Inside, a single piece of paper with 6 words typed in bold. "You can't save everyone, Maria." She burned it in the sink. Despite the intimidation, the investigation ground forward. The journalists were relentless, piecing together a timeline of financial diversions. The government probe widened into possible criminal charges. Still, the company's legal team kept everything bogged down in motions, delays, and technicalities. Justice was crawling, and Ferris and Locke was betting on exhaustion. Maria refused to tire. Through a contact in the auditing firm, she obtained something extraordinary. A misfiled internal memo from the CFO's office. It explicitly outlined strategic resource reallocations, the same language from the leaked emails, and was signed off by both the CFO and CEO. The memo was marked internal eyes only and dated during a period when the company publicly claimed full compliance with its sustainability commitments. The journalist at the Sentinel could barely contain herself. This is a direct link. Not implication, not circumstantial. Direct authorization. The memo went public. Investors panicked. Stock prices wavered. The CEO issued a video statement in which she denied knowledge, blaming rogue actions by a subordinate. But the dates and signatures told another story. That's when Maria realized the board was turning. An anonymous email arrived in her secure inbox. Internal vote coming. Leadership change on the table. If the board ousted the CEO and CFO, it wouldn't erase the damage, but it could be the crack that let reform in. Still, Maria knew better than to trust corporate self-policing. They would sacrifice figureheads if it meant protecting the deeper rot. So she prepared her final move. 2 weeks later, at the height of the storm, Ferris and Locke held an emergency board meeting at their glass tower headquarters. The press wasn't allowed inside, but the lobby was swarmed with reporters. Maria was there, not as an invited guest, but as a calculated presence. She stood near the entrance, calm, holding a single folder. The cameras noticed her immediately. When the meeting ended, the board members emerged in pairs, faces unreadable. Then the announcement came. The CEO and CFO had stepped down for personal reasons. An interim leadership team would take over. The market reacted instantly, share prices climbing slightly as if the problem had been solved. The press framed it as accountability. Maria knew better. The system had offered a controlled burn to stop the wildfire. That night, she released the final set of documents, proof that the fraudulent practices were embedded in the company's operational model, not just the actions of 2 individuals. The release went to multiple outlets simultaneously, ensuring no single gatekeeper could be pressured to hold back. The impact was immediate and brutal. The government announced a full-scale investigation into Ferris and Locke's practices, past and present. Former executives came forward under immunity deals. Shareholders filed lawsuits. And for the first time, Maria felt a shift, not just in public perception, but in the institution itself. Employees began contacting her, thanking her, sending small pieces of corroborating evidence. People who had been silent out of fear now spoke. Still, victory was far from absolute. She'd exposed the rot, but the rebuild would be slow, contested, and full of resistance. Ferris and Locke was too large to vanish overnight. It would fight to reshape the narrative again. Maria didn't care about the narrative anymore. She cared about the truth. And now, the truth was out in the open, where even the most polished press statement couldn't erase it. Late one evening, she sat by her window, city lights flickering below, and thought about the journey, the humiliation in the boardroom, the quiet nights spent gathering evidence, the fear, the threats. The system had tried to break her, but it had underestimated the one thing it couldn't buy, silence or destroy: her refusal to look away. She didn't think of herself as a hero. Heroes are clean, untouchable. She was neither. She was simply a person who had seen too much to remain part of the machine. And maybe, she thought, that was enough. The headlines faded slower than she expected. Weeks after the CEO and CFO's resignations, Ferris and Locke was still under investigation, and the scandal was a regular feature on evening news panels. Public trust had been gutted. Recruitment numbers dropped. Charity partners quietly cut ties. Maria had no job to return to. No corporate door would open for her now. But she hadn't expected one. She'd traded her career for the truth, and in her eyes, it was a fair exchange. The legal storm raged on without her direct involvement. The independent auditors, journalists, and regulatory agencies were doing the work now, and she knew better than to interfere. Her role had shifted from active combatant to witness, but a witness with a long memory and a very public voice. The threats didn't disappear. Some came in the form of polite but loaded letters from law firms, others as muttered warnings in public spaces. But she had learned something important over the past months. Fear is a tool of control, and tools lose power when you refuse to use them as intended. She poured her energy into building a network of others like her, employees from different industries who had faced similar battles against systems designed to hide abuse. Together, they began collecting and sharing strategies, creating an anonymous repository of tactics for uncovering fraud, safeguarding evidence, and surviving retaliation. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a small but respected ethics forum. The room was filled with professors, students, journalists, and a few business leaders brave enough to sit in on a discussion about corporate accountability. When she stepped up to the podium, she didn't give them the polished, detached talk they might have expected. Her voice carried the raw, steady weight of someone who had been inside the machinery. "I'm not here to tell you a fairy tale," she began. "I didn't win. Not in the way movies make you think people win against institutions. The company still exists. Many of the people who profited from its corruption are still wealthy, still influential. And I still wake up some nights to check if my locks are engaged." The room was silent. "But here's the thing," she continued. "They can't hide what we've made visible. Every time they try, the proof is already in too many hands. And every time someone like me speaks, it gets harder for them to convince the world that silence means nothing's wrong." Afterward, a young woman approached her, an intern at a major hospital. She whispered that she had seen patient safety violations covered up, that she was scared, that she didn't know what to do. Maria handed her a card with a secure contact address. The cycle, Maria knew, would continue. There would always be systems built to protect themselves at the expense of the powerless. But there would also be people willing to push back. And maybe, if enough of them stood together, the system wouldn't be able to simply replace one corrupt leader with another and call it reform. Months later, the government investigation reached its first major conclusion. Ferris and Locke would face substantial fines, and several former executives, including the CFO, were indicted on charges of fraud and money laundering. The CEO, citing health reasons, quietly left the country. The board announced sweeping reforms, mandatory third-party audits, transparent accounting for all philanthropic spending, a whistleblower protection program. Maria was under no illusions. These changes were as much about salvaging their public image as about genuine moral reckoning. But they were still real changes, codified into company policy and subject to external oversight. Kieran called her the day the announcement went public. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's more than I thought we'd see." "It's a crack," Maria replied. "Cracks are where the light gets in." By now, she had moved to a smaller apartment in another part of the city. It was quieter here, less transient. She could walk the streets without constantly glancing over her shoulder. One evening, as the sun sank and the buildings caught fire in the fading light, she stood at her window and thought about the first boardroom meeting, the laughter, the quiet cruelty of being told she didn't have permission to speak. They had tried to define her worth in terms of compliance, to make her believe her place was to observe and obey. Now her name had become shorthand in certain circles, for stubbornness, for risk, for the kind of courage that doesn't come without cost. She didn't need the company to collapse for her to know she'd made a difference. The people they had stolen from now had proof. The employees still inside knew someone had once stood up and lived to tell the story. Change, she realized, was never a single explosion. It was a series of small breaches, each one making the walls a little less impenetrable. And she would keep making breaches, not because she was fearless. She wasn't, but because fear only served them if it kept her still. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began drafting a new guide, a step-by-step document on protecting evidence and navigating hostile corporate environments. She would share it freely, anonymously if needed, so no one else had to start from zero. Her phone buzzed. Another message from someone she'd never met, saying they had a story, asking if she would listen. She smiled faintly. "Yes," she typed back. Outside, the city lights shimmered like 1,000 quiet promises. Maria knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. And in a world where power thrived on isolation, that was more dangerous to them than any headline.